It was gun control. That's what kicked off the fighting April 19th, 1775 at Lexington and Concord, the start of the War for Independence. But they never teach this history in the government-run and government-approved schools. It's almost as if they want you to believe that the founders and old revolutionaries, well, they fought this long, bloody war just so they could get some representatives to tax them. But that's a total lie. The truth? Months before Lexington and Concord, the British launched a massive campaign to disarm the people, confiscating powder, banning imports, warrantless searches and seizures, and much more. And then on that fateful day, April 19th, 1775, the patriots fought back. On this episode, I'll share the real history that almost none of us learn in school. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, April 18th, 2025. Let's kick it off by setting the stage. Of course, we have the shot heard round the world, the battles of Lexington and Concord. But to understand what led to those first shots, we actually have to back up a number of years, to the close of the 7 Years' War in 1763, which left the British Empire almost buried in debt. So they did two big things that probably changed everything. First, they stationed a permanent standing army in the colonies. And then they expected the Americans to pay for it. And how? Well, of course, it was taxes. And there were things like the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts or the Townshend Duties of 1767, and of course there was the Tea Act of 1773. And every time the British tried to push, the people pushed back with petitions and protests. And of course there was non-compliance. Sometimes it even escalated, like the massacre in Boston in 1770. But really, it was December of 1773. It all really boiled over with the Boston Tea Party. And from that point on, it was really clear that the British were not going to back down. They were going to escalate and escalate and escalate because they needed to get those people under their control. And here from a great article by Mike Meharry, he said, in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. Many people today call them the Intolerable Acts, but they weren't called that at the time. Among other moves, the British closed the port of Boston and revoked the Massachusetts Charter, bringing the colony under the total control of the British government. These actions, writes Mike, further inflamed tensions between the British and the American colonists. Many of them saw this as a further attempt to strip them of their right to self-rule and force them into submission. And, well, they were right. That's exactly what was going on. And Mike points out that General Thomas Gage was then appointed the military governor of Massachusetts. And because he was thinking that the best way, this is what tyrants always do, he was thinking the best way to keep the peace would be to disarm the colonists as much as possible. So he set in motion a scheme to secretly remove military equipment, including guns and gunpowder, from storehouses across New England. Meharry points out that most of the gunpowder and weapons stored in these magazines belonged to the provincial governments, but some of them were property of individual towns and merchants. And really the people didn't kind of note a difference. Like, oh, okay, no big deal if they're taking away all of this stuff because it's owned by the provincial government. They could see that things were ramping up and the British were really trying to kind of squeeze them down. Now, as Meharry points out, on August 31st, 1774, General Gage sent Middlesex County Sheriff David Phipps to Charleston with orders to remove the remaining powder from the storehouse. The following day, September 1st, Gage then sent a force of 250 redcoats under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Madison to seize the powder. So they're already rolling in with over 200 redcoats seizing powder. And word about this spread pretty quickly. The detachment of troops, Mike says, rode up the Mystic River from Boston and landed about a mile from the powder house. Sheriff Phipps gave the soldiers the keys to the storehouse, and they quickly removed the remaining powder. It happened without really any type of event as they were seizing the powder. It's when the rumors started spreading around that things got pretty crazy in September of 1774. Mike points out that most of the troops then returned to Boston, but a small detachment marched to Cambridge and seized 2 artillery pieces. Again, word of this spread like wildfire, so fast, especially if you think about the communication technology of then compared to now. People were getting all kinds of rumors, though, and that spread pretty quickly, too. So word got out that the British were already firing on people. Mind you, just a few years earlier in the massacre in Boston, this did actually happen. So people were ready for it again. And so word got out that they were shooting. There was also rumors that they were bombarding with warships, bombarding the port of Boston. So militia starts stepping up and pouring in from all directions. And within hours, literally within hours of all this going down, there were about 20,000 armed colonists marching towards Boston. But the rumors were false and things did quickly dissipate. But I covered this incredibly important and often ignored piece of history in the lead up to the War for Independence in an episode a couple of years ago. It was gun control, the powder alarm, and the road to independence. Now, what the powder alarm did actually show people was that the colonists were ready. They were ready and willing to do what it took to defend their liberty. And it was clear that the British knew it. And here, as T.J. Martinell points out, the British decided instead of trying to make a deal or chill out, they do what empires do. Doesn't matter what the people are saying. Doesn't matter how upset they are. Just ramp up the force. TJ writes, Governor Gage then tried another approach. Warrantless searches of people for arms and ammunition without any provocation. It's kind of like an early version of stop and frisk. And that's, bad enough. The policy, he writes, drew fierce criticism from the colonists. In fact, in the Boston Gazette, they wrote that of all General Gage's offenses, it was this one that outraged the people of Boston the most. Now, meanwhile, the Sons of Liberty weren't going to be complacent just because things dissipated and the idea that Gage and the British troops were firing on people and Boston was getting bombarded. That was all false. They were still concerned about what was going on. In fact, because he was marching troops and confiscating cannon, etc. So on September 9th, led and drafted by Dr. Joseph Warren, the Suffolk Resolves were passed unanimously. They called for a boycott of British imports and goods, non-compliance to the entirety of the coercive acts, direct disobedience to the courts, tax resistance, and more. I mean, a lot of really aggressive stuff. People would think you were a wild revolutionary today if you tried to do any of this stuff, but this was actually just par for the course. I covered that also in another episode, Blueprint for Liberty, the Suffolk Resolves of 1774. Now back to Mike Meharry's article. He said so that was on September 9th. Now we're into early October of 1774. Governor Thomas Gage dissolved the Provincial Assembly of Massachusetts under the terms of the Government Act. This is one of the coercive acts. On September 1st, he had called for the election of representatives to a general court to meet in Salem on October 5th. But on September 28th, he just discharged them. It's just one person making the choice. You're going to be here, you're not. You can have a session, you can't. But instead of following what the government people were ordering them to do, the body, Mike writes, disregarded Gage, and 90 elected representatives met as scheduled in Salem anyway. And then 2 days later on October 7th, so you're getting a lot of defiance. They're saying you can't even have an assembly. You can't have your local government. You can't have your town meetings. None of that stuff. They're going to shut it all down. And they're just saying, well, we're going to do it anyway. And so they moved to Concord, I believe is correct. And they formally organized themselves as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And Mike says that this quickly became the de facto government of Massachusetts outside of Boston, at least. From there, it assumed all powers to rule the province. It collected taxes, purchased supplies, and even raised a militia. John Hancock sent Paul Revere to the First Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia with the news that the colony had established the first autonomous colonial government in the 13 colonies in October of 1774. Not 2 full years before the Declaration of Independence, but pretty early on. And then just 1 week later, October 14th, 1774, the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress passed unanimously. They included a list of grievances, not everything from start to finish, but it started with the Declaratory Act of 1766, where the British claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. They certainly listed, though, coercive acts, and then they summed up the spirit of the day right here near the end. To these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. But while Congress was laying out principles and sending a message, the British were making some big plans. And just 3 days after that, this is October 17th, 1774, Lord Dartmouth sent a letter to General Gage with some pretty strict marching orders. Basically, disarm the people. He wrote, amongst other things which have occurred on the present occasion is likely to prevent the fatal consequence of having recourse to the sword, that of disarming the inhabitants of the Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, has been suggested. I mean, if you think about the mentality, the hubris of that, we don't want to resort to the sword. So what we're going to do is we're going to, use the threat of using the sword to take away the right of self-defense from the people. Just insane, but this is nothing new. This has been happening all through history. Dartmouth continued, whether such a measure was ever practicable or whether it can be attempted in the present state of things, you must be the best judge. But it certainly is a measure of such a nature as ought not to be adopted without almost certainty of success. And therefore, I only throw it out for your consideration. I mean, this is not an order, but, if you want to keep the peace, these people need to be disarmed. And from there, it actually gets worse. Dave Copel puts it like this. 2 days after Lord Dartmouth dispatched his disarmament recommendation to General Gage, King George III and his ministers blocked importation of arms and ammunition to America. They literally put on an import ban of all arms and ammunition, of course, unless it was going to the Redcoats. Dave writes, the 6-month decree was repeatedly renewed, remaining in effect until the Anglo-American Peace Treaty in 1783. And here's the text of the King's Order, October 19th, 1774, just a short snippet of it. His Majesty, judging it necessary to prohibit the exportation of gunpowder or any sort of arms or ammunition out of his kingdom, or carrying the same coastwise for some time, doth therefore, with the advice of his Privy Council, hereby order, require, prohibit, and command that no person or persons whatsoever, except the Master General for the Majesty's service, do at any time during the space of 6 months from the date of this order in council, presume to transport into any parts out of this kingdom, or carry coastwise any gunpowder, or any sort of arms or ammunition, or ship or lade any gunpowder, or any sort of arms or ammunition on board any ship or vessel, etc., etc., etc. And what a surprise! Read literally, Dave Copel points out, the order only required a government permit to export arms or ammunition from Great Britain to America. In practice, though, no permits were ever granted, and that's one of the tricks of permission slips. When government gets you in the trap of requiring a permission slip to exercise a natural right, there is always a danger that government is going to decide that you don't have any rights at all. Dave puts it like this. The Crown sent orders to all the colonial governors via Gage for distribution and to the British Navy to immediately block all arms and ammunition shipments into the 13 colonies. So they put on a full weapons embargo. Now, I'm mentioning a lot of original source documents, a number of articles, a few previous episodes that I've done on related topics here. And it's all really important stuff, and I'm just barely scratching the surface here. So hopefully this is interesting enough where you want to learn more on your own time. And we publish a blog post for every single episode. Well, Alan Mosley gets it organized, and I get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But in that blog post, you're going to find just below the introduction and the audio player and then the video player, you're going to find a show links section where Alan will put the reference links that I'm mentioning generally in the order that I go through to the episode. Again, so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. There's way more to learn here, and I hope you're interested in digging in deep. Anyways, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So let's get back to it. We were talking about how the British put on an embargo, an import ban on arms and ammunition. But pretty quickly, those sneaky revolutionaries started working to find a way around it. For example, Benjamin Franklin was quickly organizing illegal import of arms and ammunition from the Netherlands, France, I believe Spain as well. And as Dave points out, the Boston Committee of Correspondence learned of the arms embargo and promptly dispatched Paul Revere to New Hampshire with the warning that 2 British ships were headed to Fort William and Mary near Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to seize firearms, cannons, and gunpowder. So even though we only think of the shooting war starting in 1775, the British were really ramping it up throughout late 1774. The revolutionaries, the colonists, they certainly knew what was going on. They, at least in this situation, had some pretty good intelligence. And on December 14th, 1774, 400 New Hampshire patriots, Dave writes, preemptively captured all the material at the fort. If they had not gotten there early enough, that may have been the beginning, the shot heard round the world right there at William and Mary. But it was a little different. They ended up seizing, I think it was like 100 barrels of gunpowder on the 14th, and then they came back the very next day. There was no shooting that I'm aware of. They got 16 cannon, 60 barrels of or 60 muskets, a bunch of other military supplies. And then that same day, December 15th, 1774, Gage wrote back to Dartmouth with this: "Your lordship's idea of disarming certain provinces would doubtless be consistent with prudence and safety. Why these people think disarming an entire population is the safe approach for them, I will never understand, because it doesn't often work out that way unless the people voluntarily hand them in." And it was pretty obvious that the people at the time were not going to volunteer and turn them in. "Your lordship's idea of disarming certain provinces would doubtless be consistent with prudence and safety, but it neither is or has been practicable without having recourse to force and being master of the country." In other words, yeah, you want these people to obey. I agree with you. The way we're going to have to do this is to disarm them. You got to take their guns, but it's going to require massive force. And the word was spreading about what was going on throughout the area. And here from Gunsight, they point out that this action, this response at William and Mary, was justified by a New Hampshire patriot who described the import ban as a violation of the right to keep and bear arms. A watchman was what the essay was written under, recalled the lesson of the ancient Carthaginians, who complied with the demand that they must deliver up all their arms to the Romans, and only after that were they destroyed. And he continued with this: "Could they, the ministry, not have given up their plan for enslaving America without seizing all the arms and ammunition?" This is what was going through the minds of the people. If they're trying to confiscate arms and ammunition, they're sending in troops. What else are they trying to do? That's what governments do. Anyways, he continued, "And without soliciting and finally obtaining an order to prohibit the importation of warlike stores into the colonies? And shall we, like the Carthaginians, peaceably surrender our arms to our enemies in hopes of obtaining in return the liberties we have so long been contending for? I mean, it just boggles the mind. Certainly, a free people would never do that, especially when they have been so patient against all the injuries, abuses, and usurpations, as it's put in the Declaration of Independence. Not grievances, injuries, abuses, usurpations are the terms they use there. They've been contending for their rights for so many years, and now, rather than making progress, they're seeing their enemies be more aggressive, trying to totally enslave them. And he continued, and I must here beg leave to recommend to the Confederation of the people of this continent, whether when we are by an arbitrary decree prohibited the having of arms and ammunition by importation, we have not by the law of self-preservation a right to seize upon all those within our power in order to defend the liberties with which God and nature have given us. So his justification was, well, they're taking everything that we need to defend ourselves, our natural right of self-preservation. Of course, we're going to go and seize whatever is available in order to defend ourselves. That was published in the New Hampshire Gazette in Historical Chronicle, January 13th, 1775. And then a few weeks later, on February 9th, 75, Parliament officially declared Massachusetts in a state of rebellion. So a state of war here, really. They write, we find that a part of your majesty's subjects in the province of the Massachusetts Bay have proceeded so far to resist the authority of the supreme legislative that a rebellion at this time actually exists within the said province. Back to Gunsight. This is a really, really great resource here. Of course, it'll be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. A lot of reading. They point out that meanwhile, and I think it went back sometime in early February, where they really started ramping up the searches and seizures of arms and ammunition. They said they were being stepped up in the Boston area. An account published all the way in April of 75 alleges that troops killed several people along a road during the following seizure. So maybe there had already been another shooting by the British. We don't know if this was a rumor or not, but certainly they were seizing a lot of stuff. The Neck Guard, they write, seized 13,425 musket cartridges with ball. We suppose through the information of some dirty scoundrel, of which we have now many among us, and about 300 pounds of ball, which we were carrying into the country. This was private property. The owner applied to the general first, but he absolutely refused to deliver it. And then, meanwhile, on back to January 27th, 1775, the reason we're kind of going a little bit backwards here is that the letters take forever to cross the ocean. So on January 27th, 1775, Lord Dartmouth sent a very, very aggressive letter to General Gage, and he received this on April 14th, 1775, just days before the shot heard round the world. And the instructions were clear. Take action and be really aggressive about it. First of all, the king's dignity and honor and safety of the empire require that in such a situation, force should be repelled by force. And to back that up, Dartmouth promised more troops and fast. He said orders have been given this day for the immediate embarkation of a further detachment of 700 Marines and of 3 regiments of infantry and 1 of light dragoons from Ireland. I think that was about 4,000 troops or so if you add it all up. And then even more important, he tells General Gage, take out your opposition. No freedom of assembly, none of that stuff. That's all getting in the way and it's got to go. He said the first and essential step to be taken towards reestablishing government would be to arrest and imprison the principal actors and abettors in the provincial Congress. Those are the people, those 90, well, maybe he's just saying the principal ones, but those people who said, well, though you've dissolved our assembly, we're going to do it anyways. Well, those people need to be arrested, whose proceedings, he writes, appear in every light to be acts of treason and rebellion, treasonous to have an assembly. If regardless of your proclamation and in defiance of it, they should presume again to assemble for such rebellious purposes. And now here comes the hammer from Lord Dartmouth. He wanted these people disarmed. He kept saying it over and over. Gage was on board with it. And then, of course, he took action. He said, upon no account, suffer the inhabitants of at least the town of Boston to assemble themselves in arms on any pretense whatever, either of town guard or militia duty. Dartmouth also included a reminder that martial law was on the table, but it wasn't in order. He was basically leaving it up to Gage. And I'm not sure if this was some savvy political maneuver in case things didn't go well and he wouldn't take the blame, or if he was really just deferring to his general on the ground. Anyways, here's how he put it. It must be understood, however, after all I have said, that this is a matter which must be left to your own discretion to be executed or not as you shall, upon weighing all circumstances, and the advantages and disadvantages on one side and the other think most advisable. And he closed it out with another suggestion that maybe Gage is going to have to take it beyond Boston, beyond Massachusetts, and into places like Connecticut and Rhode Island, at least for starters. He said, it only remains for me to suggest to you whether it may not be advisable, if there should be an evident intention on the part of Connecticut and Rhode Island to support the inhabitants of Massachusetts Bay in their rebellious conduct, that the fortifications upon the island in front of the town of Newport and the battery at New London should be dismantled. It's pretty detailed for a suggestion, but he certainly did make that suggestion that Gage might have to ramp it up. Now, this is, again, it was sent in late January. Gage got it on April 14th, 1775, and it didn't take too many days for him to take action, marching troops to Lexington and Concord. And they were not there to collect taxes, and they were not going there to debate about representation. They were on a gun control mission that had been ramping up for months and months. And that's when the first shots were fired. And that's when the war for independence began. That was a fight due to gun control. And that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson wrote in the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This was passed by the Second Continental Congress on July 6, 1775. Unanimously, they're explaining why they're fighting back. And this is how they summed it up. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, in which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before. Man, what a big surprise that the government-run so-called education system never teaches really any of this to any of us as we're growing up. If you learned some of this stuff as you were growing up, count yourself one of the lucky ones, because I had to wait decades and decades to start searching this out on my own. And that's part of why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles, about these essential history lessons from the American Revolution and even much further back. So much more about the Constitution, about liberty, how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing, dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. $2 a month is where it starts over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And if you don't want to become a member, but you still want to help out, that's super cool. I'm very grateful for that as well. Or if you already are a member, which is even more awesome, but you want to pitch in a little extra, no pressure. I just want to make sure you know where you can do that. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. All spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com. patreon.com/donate. There's a number of free and easy peasy things that you can do to help us spread the word, primarily triggering algorithms on the mainstream platforms, like hitting the like button, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, subscribe, get notifications, comments in the archive. On platforms like YouTube, watch time percentage is a big hitter. So if you want to be a slugger, 80% is cool. If you think 80% of this episode is good, that's awesome. But 120 or 150 or 200%, that will help us out a great deal. And I'm very grateful for any support you can give us, whether financial, otherwise, or both. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope I made it at least interesting, a little entertaining here and there, but more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. I really hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.